If you've ever been to a Christmas service, you've heard the story of how Jesus was born in the Roman-controlled territory of Judea during the reign of Rome's first emperor, Augustus Caesar. Christianity, as a religion, was literally born in the Roman Empire, and after Christ's crucifixion, the new creed began to spread throughout its territory. The rise of Christianity coincided with a general decline in adherence to traditional Roman religion. After a century of immigration, cross-cultural exchange, economic growth, and even civil war, by Augustus's time, Roman polytheism existed more as ritual and tradition than as deeply felt belief, and its customary pantheon of gods competed for attention against dozens of various mystery cults, as well as the new belief that the empire itself, and possibly the emperor himself, were divine entities. During his reign as princeps, Augustus made organized efforts to restore the centrality of traditional Roman paganism, but it would prove to be too little too late, and in the centuries following, after Augustus's death, the slow decline of Roman religion accelerated. In its first years of proliferation, the empire did not view Christianity as anything more than a strange curiosity. It was yet another messianic movement emerging from the eastern fringes of its territory. In contrast to proper Roman piety, the very first Christians were generally perceived to be a sect of bizarre zealots. If anything, Romans broadly viewed the early spread of Christianity with bemusement and faint pity. The initial Christians were people who had foolishly rejected the religion of their fathers, Judaism, and in doing so, had shattered the family bonds and the ancient traditions of their own people. It was this radicalism, however, this willingness to give up one's own cultural heritage based on faith alone, that would eventually lead the empire to view Christianity with greater suspicion. As Edward Gibbon wrote in his massive series, The History of the Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire,
the whole body of Christians unanimously refused to hold any communion with the gods of Rome, of the empire, and of mankind. They had separated themselves from every mode of superstition, of polytheism, but it was not altogether so evident what deity or form of worship they had substituted to the gods and temples of antiquity. The pure and sublime idea which they entertained of the Supreme Being escaped the gross conception of the pagan multitude, who were at a loss to discover a spiritual and solitary God that was neither represented under a corporeal figure or visible symbol, nor was adored with the accustomed pomp of libations and festivals, of altars and sacrifices.
It was this confusion regarding the beliefs of the first Christians that would see Romans refer to this upstart sect as atheists. Though this terminology is utterly at odds with the modern use of the word, it made sense in a Roman context where public practice of religion mattered more than interior belief. Someone who made no sacrifices to the recognized pantheon clearly didn't believe in a supernatural reality that they could recognize. It was dissonance like this that led some within the empire to see the emerging Christian communities and their bizarre practices as more of a threat in the half a century after Christ's death. The most natural comparison to a modern audience is with Judaism, and the heavy Jewish population in the East and the emergence of communities in Rome itself meant that most Romans were at least passingly familiar with Jews and their distinct religion. Jews had long stood apart from the bulk of Rome's citizenry in custom and religion, but prior to the Jewish revolts of the first century, there had generally been an understanding of live and let live between the Jews and the leadership of Rome. Christians joined Jews in insisting that the most basic foundations and traditions of Roman religion were immoral. Both believed that polytheism was an abhorrent system. They acknowledged only one God. But the Christian communities began rapidly diverging from their Jewish roots when speaking of a new divine figure, the Son of this one God. Christianity first came to Roman attention because of how disruptive it was proving to be. Christians proselytized and boldly pronounced with borderline apocalyptic fervor that they held no other allegiance, not to nation nor even to their own families. Romans had accommodated and even respected Jews because they had customs that had gone mostly unchanged for centuries. This was paramount to the Romans. A differing religion or culture could be trusted only insofar as it honored its own ancient history and traditions. To honor one's predecessors and their ways was the mark of a civilized people, and one with whom the Romans could find shared interests. Christians, in contrast, were a people who would actively and consciously reject their own traditions. These people had, in many cases, alienated their closest relatives by insisting that the way they'd done things for thousands of years was wrong. The Christians believed that they had borne witness to a new revelation, one that was incompatible with the ways of their forefathers. To the Roman mind, this decision, however honestly motivated, was a mark of insolence and ingratitude. Thus, Christianity was not merely a different creed as Judaism had been. It was, to the Roman elite, an engine of social dissolution, a force which ripped apart the traditional bonds upon which Roman society was built. In the hierarchical and conservative society of Rome, how could a person who rejected his or her own parents ever be trusted? How could they ever become a loyal or honorable citizen? The first organized reprisals against Christians took place during the reign of the Emperor Nero, the fifth Roman emperor, who reigned from 54 to 68 AD. During his reign, Christians often made convenient scapegoats for the various failings of the empire. Unsurprisingly, these shortcomings were growing exponentially with Nero at the helm. The watershed event was the Great Fire of Rome in 64 AD. The fire lasted for 6 days and damaged or destroyed 2/3 of the city's structure. In the face of such an enormous catastrophe, blame had to be assigned, and a recently formed and radical sect of marginalized social outcasts, which refused to swear loyalty to the emperor, made for an easy and obvious target. As Tacitus writes in Book 15 of his Annals,
Nero fastened the guilt and inflicted the most exquisite tortures on a class hated for their abominations, called Christians by the populace. Christus, from whom the name had its origin, suffered the extreme penalty during the reign of Tiberius at the hands of one of our procurators, Pontius Pilate, and a most mischievous superstition, thus checked for the moment, again broke out not only in Judea, the first source of the evil, but even in Rome, where all things hideous and shameful from every part of the world find their center and become popular. Accordingly, an arrest was first made of all who pleaded guilty. Then, upon their information, an immense multitude was convicted, not so much of the crime of firing the city, as of hatred against mankind. Mockery of every sort was added to their deaths. Covered with the skins of beasts, they were torn by dogs and perished, or were nailed to crosses, or were doomed to the flames and burnt, to serve as a nightly illumination when daylight had expired. Nero offered his gardens for the spectacle, and was exhibiting a show in the circus, while he mingled with the people in the dress of a charioteer or stood aloft on a car.
This wanton cruelty would, in time, come to define Nero's reign in popular imagination. He's not remembered as the artist he fancied himself, but as a bloodthirsty psychopath whose name will live forever as the inspiration for the enigmatic 666 of Revelation. However, despite the extremity of his persecutions, the campaign against Christians would remain largely restricted to the city of Rome itself. Perhaps because the fire remained limited to the capital city, Nero made no wider efforts to persecute Christians in other parts of the empire. After Nero's suicide in 68, systematic persecutions of Christians slowed considerably, and Christian populations largely became regarded as a local nuisance dealt with sporadically by the governors of concerned provinces and their subordinate officials, rather than by emperors. No unified policy of persecution existed, and correspondence between Pliny and Trajan indicated that the emperor did not want Christians to be sought out or to be condemned through anonymous accusations alone. Anyone brought before Pliny who was willing to perform a sacrifice to the emperor's genius was free to leave, but those that refused were to be killed. By providing such an easy way to escape drastic punishment, we can see that Trajan did not care so much about the content of a Christian's beliefs, so much as their societal impact. It's doubtful that he cared about the defendant's theology at all, Christian or not. It was only those that refused to sacrifice that risked punishment. But before we begin thinking of this as tolerant, we can't lose sight of the fact that people died for their refusal to honor the divinity of Trajan, which is somewhat out of sync with his modern reputation as Optimus Princeps. One notable uptick in anti-Christian violence, however, is believed to have occurred during the reign of Marcus Aurelius, a man that most modern scholars likewise regard as the height of erudition and sophistication, from 161 to 180 AD. The exact causes of this spike and the actual involvement of Aurelius himself are disputed. The first truly empire-wide persecution of Christians was to occur during the reign of the Emperor Decius, who ruled for only a few short years between 249 and 151 AD before being killed alongside his son in battle against the Goths in what is now Bulgaria. This defeat made him the first emperor to die in combat against a foreign enemy. In a sign of the cataclysmic disruption that punctuated the 3rd century, Romans no longer had a monopoly on emperor murder. To understand Decius's motivations for taking systemic action against the Christians, though, it's helpful to look at his predecessor. The emperor who preceded Decius was born in the Roman province of Arabia and was popularly known as Philip the Arab. During Philip's reign, the empire had celebrated the milestone of the Roman millennium. According to the Roman calendar, the year 248 AD marked 1,000 years since the founding of the city. The occasion was marked with widespread festivities, and Philip ordered the celebration of the lavish secular games, during which more than 100 gladiators were killed in the Colosseum alone to mark the passage of an era. However, like any great historical milestone, the millennium was also an occasion for reflection, and many Romans, both in and out of the halls of power, couldn't escape the sense that things were trending unfavorably. By 248, the territory held by the empire was slowly but surely contracting. Within its borders, it faced widespread revolts and uprisings. Its politics were volatile, with the title of emperor changing hands often and often through violence. The economy was similarly unpredictable, with frequent problems including grain shortages, inflation, and inconsistent taxation. Most of all, Rome's military felt itself badly neglected. The soldiers of its legions were frequently underpaid and overworked, and in time the situation became so dire that several legions revolted, proclaiming Decius, a general, to be the new emperor, and marched on Rome to install him. Philip's own legions opposed them, but Decius's faction won handily, and Philip himself was killed in battle. However, during Philip's reign, rumors had begun to circulate that the emperor was secretly a Christian. This rumor would later be recorded as fact in the History of the Christian Church written by Eusebius, bishop of the Roman province of Caesarea, some 70 years after the end of Philip's reign. Most modern historians reject the idea that Philip was actually a Christian, but the mere suggestion, combined with the chaos of Philip's later reign, would have been damning in the Roman imagination, and it's possible that Decius's anti-Christian efforts were, to some extent, a reaction against a predecessor he imagined to have been a secret Christian himself. Either way, Decius began his consulship with a coordinated effort to make Rome culturally Roman again. He led a failed attempt to revive the bygone office of censor in an attempt to restore morality and traditional values in public discourse. When that was unsuccessful, he began an organized empire-wide campaign to bring Rome back to its traditional religious roots. In late January of 250 AD, Decius passed an edict that all inhabitants of the empire had to offer, in the presence of a Roman magistrate, a public sacrifice of food or drink, or burn incense, for the health of the empire and the emperor. In return, the person offering the sacrifice would receive an official government-issued certificate, a libellus, proving his or her loyalty to Rome and its traditions. These certificates were issued in such great numbers that many survive today. This edict was not officially targeted at Christians or at any other minority religious group, though Jews were specifically exempted, but the popular belief was that Christians, in particular, would be unwilling to offer sacrifice in the name of the emperor. The exact wording of the edict stated that the offering was for, or in Latin, pro the emperor, not to the emperor, and thus many Christians saw no issue with completing the sacrifice and receiving a certificate, having found a kind of loophole by which they could be satisfied that they were not worshiping the emperor, but merely wishing him health. However, it was not uncommon for individual magistrates to demand a sacrifice not merely for the emperor, but to the traditional gods of Rome. Additionally, magistrates often demanded the sacrifice in the name of local or patron gods. In the Roman province of Carthage, for example, applicants were made to sacrifice specifically in the names of Jupiter, Juno, and Minerva. All the same, a significant number of Christians still complied. Even confronted with these more stringent circumstances, some engaged in a kind of legalistic interpretation. Since there was only one actual God, calling him by another name didn't matter. God was God, regardless, and God would know the heart of the believer. Others, though, refused outright. The penalties for failing to obtain a certificate of loyalty ranged from confiscation of property and imprisonment to, if the refusal persisted, torture and death. Additionally, the perception that one was putting off receiving the certificate was enough to cause social stigma and alienation from one's neighbors. Many of Rome's most prominent Christians refused to obtain a certificate. The Bishop of Rome, Fabian, had previously divided the city into 7 districts and had appointed a deacon and a subdeacon as the governing authorities of each district. Many of these deacons died during the Decian persecution, as did Fabian himself, now more commonly known as the Saint Pope Fabian. The title of Pope, from the Greek papas, father, was not a title unique to the Bishop of Rome during early Christianity. It is thought that Fabian and the other martyred Roman deacons likely died in prison rather than being executed. As the edict went out throughout the empire, it was accompanied by a wave of anti-Christian sentiment. Bishops and other clerics throughout the empire were killed, including Babylas, Bishop of Antioch, and Alexander, Bishop of Jerusalem, both now regarded as saints by the Orthodox and Catholic churches. Those clerics who were not killed were generally sent into exile. Many believers went into hiding. There were anti-Christian pogroms in Carthage, Alexandria, and several other cities across North Africa and the Middle East. Alexandria, in modern-day Egypt, became home to an especially large underground population of Christian refugees, some of whom buried their dead beneath the same safe houses where they hid. After only a short time facing the new reality of the proscriptions, many Christians came to mythologize the time before Decius as a golden age, when they had not known how good they had it. Still others gave up the faith. When the Decian persecutions ended, the question of whether or not to honor the sacraments of the church leaders who had lapsed would fuel controversy. The scale and ferocity of the persecutions waned after only a year. By early 251, Decius seemed to have shifted his priorities, and in June of that year he was killed in battle. His successors, Tribonius Gallus and son Volosianus, allowed Decius's religious reforms to lapse, bringing the total duration of the persecution to roughly 11 months. Early Christians would remember Decius as a horrific tyrant, and his reign as a time of great tribulation for the church. Nonetheless, the ordeal of the Decian persecutions would also have a binding effect, as collective traumas often do, giving the Christian community a sense of having survived a great trial and emerged mostly intact. Several survivors of the Decian era would go on to become prominent figures in the church, including Dionysius the Great, who would become Bishop of Alexandria, and Cyprian, who would become Bishop of Carthage. Both were forced into hiding during the first year of Decius's reign, and both are now regarded as saints by the Orthodox and Catholic churches. A curious legend would also emerge from the time of the Decian persecution, that of the 7 Sleepers, a group of 7, sometimes fewer, sometimes more, Christian youths who hid in a cave to escape the Decian tribulations, were walled in, left to die, and emerged no worse for the wear some 300 years later. It's a kind of proto-Rip Van Winkle story, and the Sleepers are venerated not only by the Catholic and Orthodox churches, but within Islam as well. Though Christians in the empire were no doubt relieved to have the Decian prescriptions rolled back in 251 AD, they were not out of the woods. Only 6 years later, in 257, the Emperor Valerian would introduce his own anti-Christian mandates, and in 303, under Diocletian, the final and worst persecution of Christians, the Great Persecution, would ensue. The Christian Church would ultimately have the last laugh, though. Only 3 years later, in 306, the empire was in the hands of Constantine, who would not only convert to Christianity himself, but began the slow, inexorable process of converting all of Rome into a Christian empire.